Hello, and welcome to the Weshtern Philosophy Podcast. Two friends with oceans of notions discussing the unseen forces in our lives through the lens of music, mystery, and crack. We have a Patreon at Weshtern Philosophy Pod, don't forget the H. If you're enjoying the show and would like to see it grow, you can join this, or make a once-off donation via Ko-fi.com. Both links are in the show notes below. On today's episode, we are joined by mechanical engineer and yoga practitioner Shane Martin to talk about the many forms and applications of openness.
When there's those strong emotional triggers, sometimes you have to just set boundaries until you've resolved what those emotional triggers are. And frequently, sometimes we never resolve those emotional triggers in our life. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? That's the reality. And I think that is, for me personally, that is our journey, is to resolve those issues, actually, because they make you a more whole person. Yeah. And I suppose that's where openness becomes very key. So if you're looking to try and self-develop, being able to look at those hard parts of yourself means you need to be open to what comes up, to facing your demons and seeing what is there.
All right, gentlemen, are we ready? All right. Yes. Let it all out, Bart. Let it all out.
Just a bit of ASMR. Just turns him on.
ASMR I always associate with like breathy kind of khaki stuff.
I'd have to go really close to Shane's mic.
Yeah, and just go. Oh.
Deep breathing there. You know?
This is it.
Yeah, I don't know if we should. Is it the right vibe for a podcast with three men just to start with silence and heavy breathing? But anyway,
I think it's anything. It would have to. Jeez, I can't speak anymore.
That's
Never
good.
mind.
Just focus on the breathing.
Yeah. I'm only here for sound effects.
You're going to be like the guy from Police Story this episode. Yeah. So we are three men today, which is very exciting. So I will welcome our friend.
Why does he call it exciting? He gives out to me, and he calls it exciting.
Well, I'm kind of trying to go with the slightly odd undertones we're establishing here. So we'll keep them rolling as I introduce our guest, Shane Martin, who is a man who exists on many data points along the spectrum of ways of interacting with the world, because you're a mechanical engineer, you are a yoga practitioner, a climber, and also you are a purveyor of strange and esoteric texts as well.
Oh, yeah. Well, I've never been described as all of those things before, but thank you very much. I'll take that.
Welcome, Shane. Okay. Lovely to have you. You've been listening to the podcast for a while, and you were brave enough to put yourself in the firing line. So for that, we salute you.
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate it.
Your topic. You introduced your topic, and you gave a few words on like your take on this topic. Yeah. And my take was exactly opposite.
This would be very interesting.
Yeah, so I can't wait. What is your topic, Shane, and why have you chosen it?
So I was debating about what I would bring up, and I thought openness would be an interesting topic to discuss. Principally because I think openness is one of the hardest things you can do, actually. And what I mean by that is that like openness, in order to understand openness, you have to understand the opposite of it first, and that's being closed. Mm-hmm. And when you look at when you're closed, it's when you cut yourself off from relationship, really. That's what you're doing. Okay. So you're closing yourself off from relationship to others. And actually, that's the preserve of the ego, typically. The ego works to protect you as an individual. And if you actually look at what we are seeing in the world currently, I mean, I've got a lot of interest in kind of environmental matters and stuff, and you actually see where, at the root of the environmental crisis that we're going through, it's actually about separation. It's about feeling separate from nature. It's about feeling, it's treating it as a resource, as something to be consumed, as opposed to having something where you have an emotional connection with, something that you feel strongly about. It's that separation. When you look around the world, a lot of the otherness that's occurring in certain areas, that's also a product of the ego. It's about separation. So you can actually see that a lot of the issues that have emerged at a global scale are actually a reflection of the ego being materialized in the world. And I think the antidote to the ego is openness, because to be open, you have to be willing to step into and look at the reasons why you're closed. And that can be very, very difficult, both at a personal level, at a work level, at a broader level. I mean, I give an example. I also have a business, and one of our values in our business is being open. And that's very important to us as a business, because what we do is we do consultancy with our clients, and we will give them a certain product. However, we make mistakes sometimes, and when you make mistakes, the key thing is, we could hide from that mistake and not tell them about it if we found out about it. But if we do that, in the moment, it preserves our ego, because we're like, okay, we're stable, we're okay. Yet, actually, by being open, by admitting our mistakes, by telling our clients that we fucked up, basically. You may be punished in the moment for it, but actually, generally, what happens is people appreciate it.
100%.
People see that actually you're trustworthy. People see that actually this is a relationship that is worth having and worth continuing with, and it builds a stronger bond over time. So I think that's the thing. So that's where I think openness comes in. So I think for me, openness is about opening yourself to relationship. Closed is about closing yourself off from relationship. Now, there's nuance to that as well, in terms of the ego is there for a reason. It's there to preserve and to protect. That's kind of the key thing. However, the ego, in preserving and protecting, also creates a whole range of other things. It creates kind of inferiority, superiority loops, where it's constantly comparing and contrasting to people nearby, kind of going, am I better than this person? Am I worse than this person? Is that person better than me, worse than me? You're struggling all the time to try and figure out where you are sitting in the world. And that creates situations where you start othering people, where you start seeing someone as separate from you, as less than you, as maybe less than human, and that also leads to a whole range of other issues too. So, but at its ultimate thing, it's about protection. So I think, if you're open to everything, you're also wide open to both good and bad influences. So you need to be able to discern what's worth being open to and what's worth being closed to. Okay. But it's how you discern, I think. So, and I like to make the difference between judgment and discernment. So like, when we judge someone, and this is my personal viewpoint, is that when you judge someone, I feel there's usually an emotional trigger, an emotional bias behind it. It's basically where, there's a childhood wound, or there is some previous pattern where you have made an opinion, a strong opinion, or you've been hurt in a certain way. And as a result, in the moment, when you judge someone, you're judging out of that wound, essentially. You're bringing that emotional bias to the table. Discernment, I would make as the difference is where you have removed those emotional biases, or you've worked through those emotional biases, or you've released those emotional biases, so that you can actually look at two things as they are in reality and make that decision. So the ego has been removed from it. You're making that decision.
I think that's a really good point, because there's a few things you've touched on already, and I think I'm going to be the lowbrow person in today's podcast, because we're both very intelligent. I'm highly intimidated, which is another ego machination. But I think there's two things there, like what you said about admitting mistakes. I think I've said this before, like when I was a bartender, I would get the biggest tips when I went to someone, I messed up their order, and I would just go over and I'd kind of grab my shoulder and I'd go, jeez, I made fucking hames of that, didn't I? And people would laugh, and they would, at the end of the night, they would give you fucking 20 euros or something. Because I think, like you're saying, like in a way, you're opening yourself up, but also you're really in relationship.
Yeah.
Because you're not just going, chung, chung, and then what you're saying about the judgment, I think that's so true, and I really recognize that in myself. Like, there is, for me, maybe discernment isn't necessarily the place where ego goes, but it's more like it's seeing the thing without having all that emotional baggage. So it is similar, but I suppose I see it more as a slightly more mechanical or objective thing, which it never can be. But like, for instance, there'll be people I know that I'm like, oh, that's not okay, what they're doing. And that might be right, that I've seen that they're doing something that's not okay and that I don't want to be associated with. But the fact that I keep fucking sort of being reactive to it shows me, okay, there's something emotionally in me that is being triggered, and that, like you say, is so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because especially when there's someone where it's easy, I've especially noticed if I can go, no, that actually is wrong. Like someone might be fucking already upsetting me, and then they do something where I'm like, now I have a solid reason. Now I have a solid reason to go, and that's
justified.
Yes, and then that's the moment where I go, yeah, but you were already annoyed.
Yeah.
And maybe you were already seeing something, but also, and then usually it's that what's that psychology thing of like, is it something you would actually want yourself, or is it something that is opposite to you, or is it quite often if I'm annoyed by what people do, it will be something where I'm like, oh, actually, I think I might need, even if their behavior is abhorrent, there might be something in there that wouldn't be bad for me to
like,
kind of
integrate. I wish I could do that a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, I'm in an interesting, I love that discernment versus judgment thing, because I'm in a situation with somebody where I think discernment-wise, they are very out of line, you know?
Yeah.
But also, there's a few aspects to the thing that are really triggering old wounds in me.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting that I think my, how would you say it? I think my judgment and my discernment are both correct. But what's going to change it is if I act from a place of judgment, I'll act from a place of emotionality and hurt. Whereas if I act from a place of discernment, it won't change like what I do, but it'll change how I do it, which is very interesting. And interestingly, that this person is doing a lot to like violate boundaries and stuff like that. So from my perspective, openness would not be the solution to this, because actually what I need to do is keep strong boundaries with this person. But the interesting thing about what you're saying, Shane, and tell me if I'm on track here, is that openness versus close seem to be almost analogous to ego versus relationship in a certain definition.
Well, I mean, yeah, exactly, to some degree. Well, I think just you raised the point about boundaries. I think that's an important point as well. A segue too is that when you enter into a relationship with anyone or anything for that matter, you know, whether it's the environment, whether it's, you know, the sun even, right? You can, like as an example of the sun, you have to set boundaries with every relationship. You know, like the simplest one is there's the sun. You go out into the sunshine, and you know, too little, and you know you can get sick. You don't have enough vitamin D. It's poor for your immune system. It's everything else. Too much and you'll fry. You know, essentially that's the other side of it. There's a balance. There's a middle way, and that's kind of what a lot of the old wisdom traditions have talked about, is finding that middle way. And I think within relationship, that's a very important, I suppose, line to walk, because ultimately, if energetically for yourself, if you are full, and if your energy is full and you're in a good place and you're overflowing with additional energy, but then you can give to others and you can be there for others and you can have that. Yeah. But if you're drained and you're draining your own energy in order to help others, well then that's negative for you longer term. You'll get sick, or there'll be other issues that will arise. So I think your boundaries have to be set in a way that manages your energy, so that it allows you to be able to be your fullest self for the world, really, because that'll be the most beneficial for you and for others, while protecting that. So, you know, we've all had situations where we're in a relationship with somebody, a friend or anything like that, and maybe they're going through a bad time, or they're depressed, or they have an issue, and they just you go talk to them and you just feel drained when you walk away from them. Do you know what I mean?
And you've accomplished nothing.
You know, and actually, sometimes maybe the best thing to do is to say, okay, I can't have that person in my life right now. And that's a boundary you're putting in place. It doesn't mean you'll cut them out forever. Just you just, you know, for the moment, that is not the right person in my life. And maybe at a later stage, I'll be in a place where I can help them, or be in a better place to do so, but I can't. So I think, yeah, it's very nuanced, the whole conversation, really.
If somebody is, say you've known somebody 20 years and they're going through a rough patch, and they are, as you described them, that when you spend time around them, not only are they not benefiting, but you are actually being drained. Yeah. You're being dragged down. So you set like a pretty hard boundary. You set a pretty hard boundary that you're like, come here, man, I'm actually not going to talk to you until you sort this stuff out, or I'm going to take 6 weeks here and I'm not going to be answering the phone or something. Do you still consider that to be in relationship?
I think, I think you're, it's a fair point, Are you in a relationship? Are you closing off the relationship completely? Like, you know, I think if you're closing the relationship from a position of that emotional trigger or hate,
sure,
then I think you are closing it completely, because ultimately, but I think if you're having an honest conversation with them and saying, look, I'm not in the right place right now to be able to handle this.
Yeah.
You're keeping the door open for that relationship to be renewed at a later point.
Fair.
It's how you, I think it's how you respond to that person. If you just ignore them and ghost them, well, that's going to kill the relationship. Nobody likes being stonewalled. Do you know what I mean? I mean, even in a personal romantic relationship, you stonewall someone, that's it generally. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think it's how you manage that interaction and how you can transmit that in the most empathetic way for them to understand that, look, I'm just not in the place where I can handle this right now, but let's maybe touch base in 6 months when hopefully I'm in a better place.
Yeah.
I think that's the way I would treat it.
Sure.
Being in relationship, it's interesting, isn't it? Because even if you hate someone and you tell them to fuck off, in a way you are still in relationship. But I know what you mean. Like, you mean relationship as in we are actually still having a proper connection.
Well, I mean, if you close someone off and you say I hate them, like, and then I don't know.
That's pretty energetic. No, but I mean that's pretty energetically charged. Like, you're definitely still in relationship
with
them.
Being courted or whatever, you know, like that you're still attached to them, but you're just attached through a negative emotion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, very negative. Yeah. But it's interesting as well, Anthony, what you were saying about if you have someone, where you're kind of in a way you're in your right to set certain boundaries and to have certain judgments, but you try to act from what did you say? You said, I'm not trying to act from the emotion, but more from
the discernment.
The discernment. That's the one. I really wonder, and I'd like to get your view on this, Shane. Do you think that's possible? Because I think I personally actually think it is possible, but I think it's not a flowing relation. That's you have to be so careful because the emotion is such a hijacker, you know.
Yeah. I wonder I think discernment, you can probably never be 100% certain. But sorry, go on, Shane.
Well, no, I think in terms of the emotional basis, I think boundaries are needed first. So in a situation like where you get triggered, like family is a classic one. Like, I think you've mentioned this to me before. If you ever want to test your enlightenment, spend a weekend with your family. Like, so
I said no such thing.
maybe I'm paraphrasing here, but anyway, but basically, those when there's those strong emotional triggers, sometimes you have to just set boundaries until you've resolved what those emotional triggers are.
That's quite wise.
And frequently, sometimes we never resolve those emotional triggers in our life.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? That's the reality. And I think that is, for me personally, that is our journey, is to resolve those issues, actually, because they make you a more whole person.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's where openness becomes very key. So if you're looking to try and self-develop, being able to look at those hard parts of yourself means you need to be open to what comes up, to facing your demons and seeing what is there. And that is Carl Jung, who's I mentioned, he talked about your shadow. And in my experience, the shadow is in the repeated patterns that come up in relationships, but it's also hidden in those emotional triggers.
Yeah.
And the ego does its best to hide your shadow, because it's essentially always finding a way to, you never see it directly. You can never see it directly, but you can kind of see it through the echoes of its impact. And I think for me, it's those emotional triggers and it's those reflections in the repeated patterns in your relationships that give you that hint that this is a focus I need to look at. There's something here that I need to focus on. And when you start to focus on that, however you want to explore it, it's all very much a personal journey for that person.
Yeah.
But as you resolve those, if you get to the point where you can start resolving those things, you will find that your relationships change quite dynamically. Where previously, you may have, had an issue with a sibling or a parent or whatever else. You may find that they haven't changed, but your reaction to them has changed. And actually that changes the whole relationship, because you're not being triggered, you're not responding the way you'd usually respond, and that gives them the space to treat you very differently. So I think,
but not necessarily.
Yeah,
You can't do it for the hope of that outcome.
No, you can't do it for the hope of that outcome, but ultimately it brings you to a better place of peace well, then that is a fantastic outcome.
Yes, absolutely.
You know what I mean?
And people can really surprise you, especially when you don't have the expectation of it, and I'm just doing this for me, and because it'll be better for myself and everyone around me if I can resolve that. But I do find the energetic ties of it usually work quite instantly. Now, whether other people pick up on that, that's something else. But I've literally had walked out of a really meaningful therapy session or whatever, and my son just picking up on that, even though he was halfway across the country, going, this now, because the familial system kind of changes, and that kind of stuff I think is amazing. The thing that I find really helpful when you do get more and more aware as well of all the tensions in your body and the emotional kind of triggers and stuff. And I did a thing once in Holland. There was I did it here, but there's a yogi called Juno Berg. He's a lovely guy. He has this program called The Invitation, where he makes you set an alarm on your phone 7 times a day, and then when the alarm rings, you have to kind of go, okay, what's alive in me right now? Just feel into that, and then you pick for the week you're doing it. You pick your favorite problem, so the thing is always happening to you, or you're always coming back to, or the mistake you always make. And then so you kind of go 7 times a day, you kind of go check in, what am I like now? First of all, very interesting how up and down we are during the day. That's already an interesting thing to realize. Then he goes, okay, well, this is where you're at right now. Now think of that favorite problem you have. And, usually you'll get more tense or whatever will happen. And he goes, okay, and now you've sensed that. In a way, you've kind of sensed the difference between the two states. And now, whatever you're feeling in your body right now, just allow it compassionately. You're not going to change it. You're just going to see it. You're going to feel it. You're going to acknowledge it. And you're going to go, I'm not going to do anything about you. And that's amazing to me how much space that already creates. That doesn't mean there doesn't need to be any other process. But that's one I use a lot when I notice, okay, acting fairly triggered. Can feel it. Where am I feeling it in my body? And then just bring attention and compassion to it. Because the compassion is, I'm not going to change it. Because normally we'll go, pain in my neck, fucking. But that makes
you at war with it.
Yeah, exactly. You kind of go, I want this to be gotten rid of, and it gets more tight, But I don't know why I was saying that, but that's one that I find really helpful with that stuff, to at least open the door a tiny bit to allowing a different view of whatever you're experiencing, but it is uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because there's a reason you're not doing it. And I think it's good to acknowledge that as well, where you go, I've been doing X, Y, and Z forever because of something.
Yeah, well, it's. I think I think it's amazing that we can go through an emotional, call it a trauma or a trial or whatever it is. Say you're a kid, you're 12 years old, you're kind of powerless, and somebody in a position of power, calls you names or whatever. You go through a situation where you don't have the spiritual or mental or emotional capacity to handle it, okay? You don't have the tools. And the body's like, I'll carry that. And I think that's incredible. The body's like...
you're too young actually to deal with this.
Yeah, so the body's like, I will hold this for a while, and I'll hold it for as long, but please do come back and get it at some point, And the body holds it, and it might hold it as TMJ or IBS or whatever it is. And years later, decades later, at any time we can go into the body and go, shit, I fucking forgot about that. What are you? Where did this come from? And that's a way in. But again, like you said, Bart, if you just start taking painkillers or just I'm just going to go to the physio and get rid of this, that is, by the way, there's no judgment here. Sometimes you've got back pain and you want your back pain to go away. That's really, anyone that can do that for you, that's a really valuable thing. But for stuff that keeps recurring, for stuff that might have an emotional component, the fact that we have the ability to go into our body and deal with stuff that we couldn't deal with 10, 20 years ago, I think that's incredible.
I had a really exactly that this week, because I have a thing with my foot. My left foot is pretty straight and grounded, and the right one is always kind of collapsing inwards. And I think 2 years ago or so, I went to see Breed O'Donoghue, who was on before, the psychic, and she said, that's something you need to. I wasn't aware, I didn't have any pain, but I was kind of aware that it was a bit, And she was like, yeah, that's because sometimes you found it hard to be in the world, so you're kind of 1 foot out the door, you know. And she was like, you might want to have a look at that at some point, you know, or feed into that. It's like, oh yeah, I will, but then life is fucking busy. Now it's starting to hurt. So that's always a great trigger. And it's kind of, was one of the first times something started to hurt in my life where I was like, oh, thank you. Now I will actually do something with you. And I went to see Joe Flincher, all the guests are named. And he was like, okay, yeah, these muscles, you want to train them a little bit. And what do you think the emotional thing is underneath that? I was like, this and that. He's like, okay, maybe this, or I will feel into that. And I was like, well, that's kind of perfect, isn't it? Because you're doing something on the physical level, but you're also looking at the tension. Now, we'll have to see how it goes, and I want my money back, Joe, if it doesn't work out. But that's, I think, is a perfect example of it.
Yeah.
How, like, you clearly have thought about this a lot, Shane. Has that been a constant companion for you, or is that something of the last couple of years? Or
I mean, openness or
openness and awareness to, well, this openness, the way you're talking about it really makes me think about how we deal with the discomfort in ourselves in a way, and the emotional holding. I think that's kind of what you're speaking to.
Yeah, I suppose for myself personally, I think, I don't know, all my life I've kind of always, anytime, even since I was quite young, anytime there's been a challenge, I would kind of generally run towards it as opposed to run away from it. So
that's interesting, isn't it? That's kind of a personality
trait,
thing,
maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, even when I was a kid, I used to be afraid of roller coasters, and then my dad and his partner and went to Alton Towers, and I jumped on all the roller coasters, and I said, I have to fucking do this, and then I fucking loved it. Do you know what I mean? So, do you know what I mean? And I think there's been a lot of situations in my life where fear has kind of surfaced, and I would have rather stepped into that rather than run away from it. And I think, and as a result, there's been a lot of growth from that, I think. I'm to the point about growth. I think for me, personally, I would say is that, I mean, I'm in my early 40s now, and in my late 30s, I had seen a lot of recurring patterns come up in my relationships, especially my romantic relationships. And that made me realize, like, when you look at my life, I was kind of, okay, this is something that I need to focus on. It seems to be recurring. And that was something I decided to give focus to. And that led me on a bit of a journey in the last 5-6 years, where I started to explore a whole range of different modalities, I suppose. You know, I also had a near-death experience about 7 years ago, where I was rock climbing and took a 50-meter fall, which is 14 stories. So that was a bit of a wake-up call too. So on the back of that, then I started kind of, beginning to...
Such a fucking long way. Jesus Christ. Because I know that story, but you said it there and it just hit me like, oh my God. It's amazing that you even, like, fucking 5 meters could do it for you. Oh.
Yeah, it's quite a distance, right? Yeah, for sure. So basically, and some of the recurring patterns that were coming up for me was that I kind of had seen that I would get into a relationship, I would fall in love with the person, then my inner critic would come up, and I'd start to find problems, I'd start to find issues, I'd question what was this or not that, and then the first time there was a problem, I would cut the relationship, and I'd leave. Then once I'd left the relationship, I'd regret it. I'd be like, why did I do that? That was very stupid of me. I'd try and get back into the relationship. That wouldn't work. Obviously, the trust had been broken. And then I wouldn't grieve properly. I wouldn't deal with it. And then I would just jump into the next thing. And then I would bring that, because I hadn't processed the grief from the previous relationship, I would hold on to those patterns of that previous person in that new relationship. So it would end up creating friction. It would help me, that inner critic would be comparing and contrasting to the previous person, and it was stopping me moving on. This was a kind of a recurring theme that kept on coming up for me. So I was kind of like, I knew that there was an issue there, and I wasn't sure where that pattern was coming from. And I actually had signed up to do a silent meditation retreat in 2018. Then I had my climbing accident, so I couldn't do it. Then I never got around to it after that, and then COVID hit, and I went, well, you know, I'm not going anywhere, so I might as well kind of go deeper into my own self-exploration. So I heard about some plant medicine retreats, around Wachuma and ayahuasca, and I decided to go on a Wachuma retreat, and that was kind of a weekend retreat. And when I went to that, I had a very bodily experience, actually. So some people expect you're going to go off and see visions, or you're going to, go into the lunacy of madness, or whatever it's going to be. But for me, I just literally, I took it, and it was a 6-hour trip of me lying there with my whole body just shaking and shaking and shaking, and my head just kind of going, what the fuck is going on? And I ended up just going with it and letting it happen, letting it just work through me. And afterwards, I felt very kind of almost disembodied for a period of time, for about 3 or 4 weeks, and not too sure if I wanted to have that experience again. I'm not too sure what had happened, actually, because of just like the thing I found with like plant medicines and those type of they throw you down into a hole, and then they eject you straight out of it. So it's very hard to integrate the experience. It's very hard to understand what just happened, really. Then I actually had an opportunity in an ayahuasca retreat, and several months later, I tried that, and I found again that I had a very physical bodily reaction as well, and it was very difficult to kind of process that afterwards. Then I suppose in the following year, I had another Wachuma retreat, and in that I got an insight into a childhood pattern that was leading to the inner critic. So that was a childhood pattern from when I was very young. I hadn't realized it, and maybe I won't go into it in too depth, but basically there was a pattern there which formed that inner critic. It was basically where it was a protection mechanism that formed, that meant that when I was in a relationship, I was looking for perfection. And that was the thing. So I got an insight into that. Then basically towards the end of that year, that was in 2022, I decided to do a silent meditation retreat, 10-day silent meditation retreat. And it's very interesting you talk about a somatic response to emotion. So up to that point, I suppose, in our traditional modern medical model, they believe that, I don't know, this is my perception, maybe it's not true, but my perception is that they believe that most of your emotions in your brain and everything works in the mind. It's up here, and the body is separate. The body just does functions that is, non-conscious. It's basically, processing your food and everything else, but it's not, it's separate to the mind. That's kind of the perception I've always had, at least. And I think actually it's all connected, really. It's all one. So on this retreat, what's very interesting is I did a Vipassana retreat, a 10-day silent meditation retreat, and you spend the first 3 days just focusing on your breath, inhalation, exhalation, and kind of trying to get to a point where you're narrowing your focus over those first 3 days. And that's quite tricky. They call the thing called a monkey mind, where your brain is running off and saying, what the fuck am I doing here? What's going on, etc. And you're trying to quieten that to a point where you've got a really high level of focus on one portion of your body, which is the top of your lip. Then on day 4, they introduce the Vipassana technique, which is where you move your focus from a single point in your body and you start doing full body scans. That becomes like you've developed a sixth sense, because you start to feel pain, pleasure, and all sorts of sensations across your body that you've never felt before, because you've got such a high level of focus. And what your man Goenka, who developed that course, says actually is that your subconscious is mapped across your body. And I've come to realize since then it's mapped across your nervous system, actually. And that every time you have a strong emotional reaction to something, whether it's a craving for something or a strong aversion to something, you lock an emotional pattern into your body. And every time that pattern is repeated, it gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And eventually, it can emerge as illness. And what's interesting is that as you scan your body in that highly sensitive state, you can feel these blocks within your body. And it's hard to describe unless you actually go through the experience, but you feel these blocks. And the idea is that you give your awareness to those blocks without emotion. So without a craving and without aversion, you just give your awareness to it. And that's when things begin to change. That's when, like when you do that, stuff begins to come up, and you can actually face you can face those emotional triggers or those emotional demons that you have in a very visceral way through your body. So you actually, rather than I suppose you can go to therapy and you can talk it out with the psychologist, or you can go through your body and try and actually do it. And for me, that was a very powerful methodology to treat that kind of those inner issues, basically.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because one of the first things I wanted to say when you started talking about openness versus closedness and what I read as ego versus relationship, and you were talking about the role of the ego as protector, as boundary holder, right? So there's the ego, the I, and then there's the relationship with other beings. And the first thing I thought of was, what about non-egoic boundary holders? What about animist forces? What about like the things that might protect you that are not the ego? Because it's not just about us and other people. There is a whole world out there. And interesting, you talked about something like Huachuma, which, from my understanding of it, they say it's a feeling medicine, as in you feel in the body and you feel in the emotions, but you're not tripping. The mind is actually, they say it's heart-centered, you know? And this idea of going in through the body, there's aspects to openness and closeness that are separate from ego and relationship as well. Or maybe they are like greater relationship with greater forces out there. And I think it's so interesting that, yeah, you encountered these things. You've had a wild ride, Shane. You know, like, and, you know, and something I really admire about you is how you have this mindset of like going into challenge and also being quite analytical, because that is your nature. You're an engineer. But I don't think you buy into the primacy of the analytical mind. I think you view it as like a tool amongst many, and you have found other non-rational, non-conscious, non-analytical tools like Huachuma, like Vipassana retreats and so on, that have been incredibly beneficial to you. Yeah. So the ability to like have a predilection, have, you know, your whole business is based on engineering. Like you're good at it. Like it's measurably benefiting you, but to also be able to step outside that and explore other avenues, I find.
Well, I think that's part of being open, really. So, like, I mean, I think when my early 20s, I would have classified myself as an atheist, actually. Do you know what I mean? I was kind of growing up in very Catholic Ireland, having to go to church every Sunday, sitting there, you know, in the church praying, never seeing the results of my prayers, and feeling that this is just nonsense, basically, you know what I mean? And that feeling that we're reading a Bible and it wasn't resonating with me. I and then going through university, studying engineering, seeing the world through, I suppose, scientific materialism, which is, you know, everything can be explained through the material world. I felt I became pretty much an atheist. And then it was my mid-20s I started to explore Buddhism more from an interest in understanding the mind and an understanding, to some degree, self-development, actually. Okay, like they've spent 2,500 years studying the mind, and you know, there was a great book called The Art of Happiness by the Dalai Lama, which is an interaction between a psychologist and the Dalai Lama, which just talks about how Buddhism views happiness and the process of becoming happy. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. Like he's opening up to, I suppose, he's introducing the scientific method into their religion. And what I found even more fascinating is that about that approach, and about a lot of the Eastern approaches, is that, you know, my view of Christianity as a child is that you just have to have faith, which is just you have to have faith and it will all work out. Where what I found about those Eastern religions was that there was about, no, but this is what we teach. If this resonates and if this works for you, then implement it. If it doesn't, then throw it out. And I thought that was very powerful, because it meant that you would develop your own spirituality or your own view of the world through your own direct experience. And I still believe that is, from my own experience, that is the most powerful thing, you know. So I was an atheist in my early 20s, and then I remember when I was looking at meditation, I was at a later point living in Chile. I lived in Chile for 7 years in South America. I was working over there, and I decided I would try to meditate. It was the first time I tried to meditate. I remember sitting in my bed in my apartment at the time, and I put on an app, which was just a simple meditation using breathing, inhalation, exhalation. And it was about 11 at night. I put it on. It was only about 5 minutes long. I did it. And I just remember sitting there, and then the time stopped, and I came out of it about 30 minutes later. And when I came out of it, I was fully refreshed. I couldn't sleep all night. I was just like fully energized. So I didn't know what that was. It was just kind of a very unusual it was just a very unusual kind of data point, and it kind of made me kind of interested to pursue it further. And I remember later, a few years later, I was down. So what I was doing in Chile at the time is I was working for a company developing wind farms, and I had to visit. Had some great journeys. So, I mean, there was this site we had to visit down the south of Chile. It was 10,000 hectares, which is enormous, right? I mean, it's fucking absolutely enormous. And it was on this plateau, and the only way to access it was to access it on horseback. So, and the owner of the land didn't live near the land. They lived in Santiago. But when we were going down to visit the site, they suggested that we stay with a local farmer who had a small landholding of, a few acres, a guy called Miguel. Miguel and his wife.
Oh, sorry there, guys. I was trying to be subtle, and
I saw your attempts at subtlety developing. Yes.
Yeah. So basically, Miguel and his wife, like Miguel is in his 70s, like he was an old guy, and me and a guy who I was working with, Mario at the time, we went down to visit Miguel, and we rented horses off him, and he took us up for the day. So Miguel put us on the horses, right? And then he ran in front of the horses up a really steep hill, because he'd been doing this every day. Like, so we're on the back of horses as he's running up the hill, and then we're kind of going around the site doing a bit of a survey. And halfway through the day, I get up to jump on the horse, and the horse bolts my foot in the stirrup, so I get dragged along the ground, bruised the hell out of my back. Anyway, I was in bits, and Miguel gets me, throws me over the horse, and brings us back down to his house. And we were due to stay in his house for 3 days anyway, while we were doing this kind of site visit. It ended up being, I was absolutely in bits. Then Mario, we were served dinner by Miguel's wife, and went to bed. Next morning I woke up, I was in a lot of pain. I just wasn't getting on a horse to do anything that day. And Mario was vomiting. He was not in good shape either. So because whatever, he didn't react well to the food. So it ended up being that he stayed in bed, and I ended up spending the next 2 days in the kitchen talking to Miguel and his wife. And it was fascinating to talk to them. Like, they were very Christian, very Catholic. Their view of the world is that they spent all the days on the farm. 1 day a week they would go into church on a Sunday. They would what do you call it? That's when they get their food and interact with their community, and then they come back, and then they would listen to the radio once a day, and that was their whole interaction with the outside world. And I remember the conversation quite quickly, in my broken Spanish at the time, quickly turned to kind of matters of spirituality and God, because that was one of their core interests. And what always struck me is Miguel at the time, Miguel and his wife were really, really happy, and Miguel when he talked about his spirituality, he talked about, I see, when I'm out every day, I see God in nature. I see it in the wind. I see him in the wind. I see it in the flowers. I see it in the animals around me. And at the time, I had as I mentioned, quite an atheistic view, and I kind of, could find lots of ways to bring quite strong arguments about why the Bible was nonsense, or how it was written long after Christ died, and how it was used for power and exploitation, how religion has done all that kind of stuff. And I thought about bringing up those arguments, and at the time I decided, actually, hold on a second, who am I to turn? Like, they're in their 70s. Who am I to say anything? Like, they're very happy. They seem to have a really nice way of life. Like, I kind of realized, what do I really know? And it kind of stuck with me, actually, that they were tapped into something that I wasn't. Yeah. And then later I decided to, it was a few years later, I had interacted with a guy who was a conservationist for a period of time. I learned a huge amount from him in Chile, and befriended him. This guy called Douglas Tompkins, and he kind of inspired me to kind of dig deeper into kind of environmental matters. And I realized from that experience that when you look at, it brings up the point I mentioned earlier about separation, is that humanity, because we treat nature as a resource and we've lost our emotional connection to nature, we don't value it. And because we don't value it in that way, then we destroy it to some degree. That's the big thing. And I realized that if we wanted to solve the environmental crisis at a very deep level, we had to basically emotionally connect back to nature. So I decided, what, I'm going to try, and I thought I would do a 6-day hike from Chile into Argentina over the Andes by myself. So there's an old route called the Ruta de los Jesuitas, that it's the old Jesuit route that connects basically northern Patagonia with Bariloche. So basically from the Chilean side into the Argentinian side. And it's a really old route that used to be used frequently to export fur and other kind of raw materials from Bariloche over to the sea in Chile. But it's been closed off now for about 100 years because it goes over land by trucks now. But you can still go through it, and up when you follow that route, there was like 2 or 3 very small farms on that route that are literally traditional cowboys. Like, they're called Huasos down in Chile. Like, they live up there all year round. They have their cattle that they move between a few pastures. They come down once or twice a year to sell their cattle, and that's it. So on that hike, basically, I was pretty much by myself the whole way, and I kind of stopped off to I met 2 of the Huasos on the way, but that was about it. On day 4, I got lost for like 16 hours, and I remember I got totally lost. And I had walked 5 hours beyond the last place where I could get water. So I ran out of water. I was exhausted. It was really hot and sunny, and I got quite delirious. And I was looking for the path. Finally, I found the path, and it was up a really steep hill. So I followed up to the top of the hill. Realized that I had actually left my GPS at the bottom, so I had to run back down and run back up. So I was looking totally delirious. Walked on and finally found a river which I could get water in. Couldn't find the trail after that. So I just ended up camping by the river for the night. And when I did, I cooked up some food and ate the food. And I just started vomiting everywhere. I couldn't keep it down, so I wasn't feeling well. But the craziest thing was that when I lay down to sleep that night, and I put my ear to the ground, I heard the sound of flutes playing into my ear. And it was wild. I just sat there kind of going, okay, this is am I fucking tripping, or what the hell's going on? Do you know what I mean? And at that point, I'd never done anything like hallucinogenics or anything. So for me, it was just like, what the hell is going on? And I just heard it playing away, in this soft sound of flutes, and I just drifted off to sleep. And I remember waking up the next morning and feeling this enormous sense of connection with everything around me. And I just sat there for the day, not feeling too well, but just in front of this massive glacier that was crackling and popping all day, and feeling connected to this just beautiful virgin rainforest I was sitting in. And that really kind of made me have a very strong connection to nature, maybe want to do a lot more for it, actually. So yeah, that was kind of, anyway, around about Robin. So.
I love it. Jesus, that's a beautiful story, Shane. Thank you for sharing so openly. I actually wrote down about 20 things, but they're not all relevant anymore. But I think I love that you were like, sometimes it's quite literal, isn't it? You were like, oh, I got on the path again, and I was like, or you're like the path up to the hill. I was like, well, that sounds like a religious experience getting ready to happen. And then you go, put my ear to the ground. There we go. Or not religious, but spiritual or really connected. I don't mean to diminish it in any way. I mean it's like it's so deeply meaningful. And I love what you were describing about. I have so many friends like this who all started out having real issues with the church, being atheists, but then actually being kind of genuine, scientifically minded in a way where there's an actual exploratory desire, or people actually go, yeah, okay, maybe let's not do that shit because that's not looking too good. Okay, so we're going over here. Okay, materialism. Yeah, okay. Oh, actually, I'm noticing this thing over here. I know so many people who went from religious upbringing to reject that, atheism, to kind of scientific exploration, to, actually, there's more than materialism, to, actually, some of that stuff, there was actually some value to it. I know so many people who've gone through that, and not now we're suddenly going to say that start point was right as well, because there was something to be rejected, 100%. But then also circling back, like you say, with being in the kitchen with Miguel and going they are actually tapped into something. I love that's the openness. If you talk about openness, it's quite, I feel it in my body, it's quite moving. That's the moment where you actually do something. It's a small step, but that's kind of the step we need. If everyone can make that little step where they go, actually, instead of going into the ego and going, I know, sorry, dude, I'm sorry you believe this fucking fairy tale, but I'm going to tell you what, that's all fucking ego. But you actually go, wait a minute, I know I have some good arguments here, but what these people are saying, they're clearly living a good, and then to go into the fucking jungle and connect that way, it's fucking beautiful, man.
Yeah, and when you met Miguel and his wife, you also didn't go the other way and go, oh, now I'm Christian, I want to be like them.
Exactly, which would also be an issue.
Like you held on to yourself. Yeah, I think that's a definition of openness I can really, really respect as well. I agree with you there, Bart.
Yeah, and I actually had, last year I had an experience that I can't talk too much about, but it was similar about connecting to the land. And oh, Jesus, it's a beautiful feeling. When you really put your fucking face to the floor of the earth and it speaks to you. It goes, yeah, I want you here, man. And it's like you feel so held, and then you want to do something for it as well. I think that's amazing.
You said something, Shane. You said because we treat nature as a resource, we are kind of disconnected from it. We're not in a relationship with it, and therefore we destroy it. Have you listened to the Emerald podcast, the episode for the intuitives?
No.
So he talks about basically intuitives, oracles, people that are in touch with other forces, animist forces. And in part 2, not to spoil anything, it is literally probably my favorite 2 or 3 hours of podcasting of all time. So I would recommend, if anyone here is interested in any of the stuff we're talking about, check out the Emerald in general and the 2-part episode for the intuitives in particular. But his argument is that all cultures, all civilizations throughout all of human history have had connections to land. They have had oracles and seers and people that connect with animate forces until modern society. We are the first society in human history that rejects all these things in favor of scientific materialism, capitalism, all these other what they would call tangible, phenomenological practices. But he kind of inverts what you were saying. He said that those things, those practices that might bring us into the land or bring us into the past, where we are looking at, for example, the difference between discernment and judgment. If you're judging, if you're having an emotional response, that might be a call for you to go into your past. But as a society, we are obsessed with individuality, and also constant growth, constant expansion. So his argument is that you actually had to get rid of the intuitives. You had to repress people that connect with the land. You had to repress people that connect with the past in order to facilitate modern culture. It's not a thing that just happened. It's not that we lost connection with nature and therefore we started to use it as a resource. He would say that in order to use nature as a resource, we had to be separated from it, possibly a little bit forcefully. I think it's a really interesting argument. And we had Diarmuid Ling in last week as well, and many people are actually talking about this, and that, rather than looking at our carbon footprint or things like this, what's actually going to lead to a sustainable solution or improvement in the state of the natural world is actually anything that reconnects us to it. Would you agree with that, Shane?
I would agree with that. Yeah. I work in the renewable energy space and have done for the last 20 years, and I think our industry uses climate change as the kind of as its modus operandi to justify what we do. And I not to say that climate change doesn't occur, but I think that it's one of many things that does occur. So there's climate change, but there's also, we're losing sea ice at an exponential rate. We're deforesting the world at an exponential rate. We're losing arable land at an exponential rate. We're also going through the 6th mass extinction crisis the planet's ever faced. So, all of those things are symptoms. They're not the cause. And that's a big issue for me, is that like the actual cause, when you strip it all back, it's the globalized infrastructure we've built to convert resources into waste. That's actually the issue. And it's the way we extract the resources which is the issue. So when you look at nature produces an abundance, okay? It also produces a surplus every year. So we as humanity, when we extract resources, we don't just take the surplus, we end up undermining the resource base itself, and we're continually doing that. Yeah. So it's like this thing what I talked earlier about energetically, where, if you're full and then you're overflowing, you can then give. But if you're not full and you're giving, then you personally are dropping down. Nature's doing that at the moment. It's giving more than it can, and it's as a result, it's not able to support us. But also as humanity, we're in a very unique position as humans, is that we are extracting from nature at a detrimental rate. However, we could be helping manage nature in a way that it provides and grows soil and provides more benefits and also supports civilization as it is. It's just that the way we do that is really flawed. If you look at nature, there is a thing called a keystone species. So there is a very famous YouTube video about the wolves in Yellowstone National Park.
It is my favorite video on the internet. How wolves change rivers.
Yes, how wolves change rivers. Yeah, exactly. And in that podcast, in that video, they talk about basically how they reintroduced wolves into Yellowstone National Park, and that changed the entire landscape. And it did so because the wolves are a keystone species. They sit at the top of the food chain. When you introduce them, they start hunting deer. The deer now no longer accumulate on the sides of banks. Therefore, vegetation can come back, and that vegetation can come back, and therefore then over time that actually changes the course of the rivers, as an example. Humans are a keystone, can be a keystone species. We're not acting as a keystone species at the moment. We are actually acting as a thing that is destroying most of life and creating that extinction. But we could be a keystone species. We could be actually facilitating and allowing a lot more life, a lot more diversity in the ecosystems around us, and therefore we could be, as an adjunct, we could be sequestering more carbon as a result, cleaner air, cleaner water, and also providing food for the world. There's this concept at the moment that it's bandied around a lot on TV, is that we're running out of food. That's actually nonsense, really. When you look at how we manage our land, we use these monocultures in our landscapes, which are not natural. Like, monocultures don't exist in nature. That's where you have the one crop over a large area. And that's done because of mechanization. If you've got one single crop, you can bring in mechanization, and it's easier then to extract from that environment. But that doesn't exist naturally in nature, because nature will generally try and send its weeds and send everything else to try and diversify that piece of land. So we have to use chemicals and chemical inputs and fertilizers, and all of that degrades the soil. And when you're degrading the soil, you're degrading your resource base on an annual basis. So it's managing the land in that way is very efficient from a labor perspective. It's not efficient from a land use perspective. So if we were to introduce more labor back into the landscape, where people are actively managing the land and bring in more complex systems, we can extract more land per acre than we can using our current system. So actually we can provide even more food than we do at the moment, and there's already a surplus of food. It's just badly distributed. But we can actually extract even more food in a much more efficient manner if more labor was used on the land and more complex systems were used, as we did historically. It was just only in the last 60 years we've kind of brought this modern system in, where we use a lot less labor, so a lot less people are involved in food production. But as a result, we're now more disconnected from the land. I actually think one of the solutions is bringing people back into food production. Bringing people back, we all have to pay more money for food, but bringing back people, that brings back more management of the land, direct management of the land. It brings back connection to nature, and it brings back a whole philosophical change in how we manage our society. I think that's one of the key things that has to change.
Boom.
So
nailed it.
So
no, but seriously, I love that. And I mean, isn't it why, like, you love going to Harry's farm at Lochavala, like someone who actively and lovingly tends his land and is fucking happy as Larry doing it, but we're going to put now to the test one of the things we discussed at the beginning of the podcast, because one of the things you're speaking to, I know I have an emotional baggage with. And it's not with you, don't worry. But I think because the image you're painting there, I really like. I think that's a beautiful way of looking at it. The thing that triggers me emotionally is that there seems to be, well, Diarmuid Ling said it really well, there's been a co-opting of the sustainability space, where now they are actually trying to force us into scarcity. I know that's too big a thing to say that about the whole space, but what I see in that space, especially with the you will own nothing and be happy kind of thinking. I know you don't like authoritarianism. One of the things I really have a problem with is that sustainability is currently being used in some parts to sort of give people a sense of original sin again. Like instead of going, hey, let's connect to nature. It's like, no, you're bad. You're a cancer on the world. As humanity,
a virus.
We're like, and you should just do less and less and less and produce less CO2. I won't be surprised if there's gonna tax like our expenditures connected to CO2 or something like that. Whereas actually, it's creating scarcity in humans, and when there's scarcity in humans, they're not going to care about their environment more. They're just going to be in survival mode, and will get all much meaner and greedier. Whereas actually, if there was that abundant mindset, they would also then overflow and look after them. So I think you've really tied in really nicely that idea of you need to be abundant in order to be able to give. But I think what's happening now with the CO2 counting and stuff is that will create scarcity in people, and then will create scarcity for the land as well.
I've always thought it kind of made sense for big companies, like huge multinationals, to be like, oh, if they reduce their carbon footprint by 5%, that could have a really big effect. But I also thought it was weird to apply it to individuals, because it just leads to shame and guilt and feeling bad. And yeah, what do you think, Shane?
I think there's an old adage: beware of the greater good being used for social control.
Yeah. Wow. Could you say it again?
Beware of the greater good being used for social control.
That's what it is.
It's been used time and time again, mainly in very communist countries in the past. But Pol Pot it was a classic example of that. Even Hitler did the same thing. So justifying wiping out another race because it's for the greater good of our population, or do you know what I mean? That's kind of how it's done. And just the climate narrative that has formed. I think that there is justification for the climate. I do think there are all of these impacts, and I do think things have to change.
Yes.
But I also think we have to be aware of the systems of control that can be implemented around that. There can be a true crisis, but people will implement these systems of control. And I follow both left and right kind of commentators, and you can see the right already talking about how climate change is all nonsense. So you're flipping the other way, where basically there is actually a problem. Mm-hmm. But now there's one side of the spectrum that's I suppose that's kind of rising globally at the moment, which is basically saying that's all nonsense. Let's deregulate, let's destroy, let's go and destroy our national parks, let's extract more resources because let's just throw out the baby with the bathwater, really. And I think that's very dangerous as well. So I think we have to be very careful of the narratives that are used around these kind of topics.
And that's kind of the same thing as what we were just discussing about religion. It's like you had an issue with organized religion, but then threw out spirituality, but then you didn't. Or maybe I shouldn't say it like that, because in a way you didn't, but you kind of revolted against organized religion, but then we're like, oh, but actually there is something in there. I'm not going to throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I think that's a perfect example. Like the right completely going, we're going to deregulate is bad, but then the left going, people in rural areas can't drive more than 20 kilometers. Like that's a nightmare as well.
Or they can't burn turf. Like, do you mean a tradition that's been there for 100 years? And when you actually look at it, it's kind of mad. Is that okay? You've got people in rural areas who've been cutting and burning turf for a long period of time. So, okay, we need to change the mindset that they can't do that. But that's not really the problem and the source of the major issues. They're deploying data centers at scale, which are using far more energy than anything else. Do you know what I mean?
But we're going to go after the turf cutters.
Go after the turf cutters. And it's
always that. But it's always that. It's always like people I was reading this thing about that everyone will have to have their old septic tanks up to spec, which might be a great idea. Mm-hmm. But at the moment, that would mean that homeowners would have to pay fucking, I don't know, you probably know better than me, but like 20 grand or something to get that all dug up and sorted. Meanwhile, government dumping shit in the river, all the fish die. You're like, it's that kind of way. It's like people in G4 jets flying around the world telling us all that we're bad and we should be different. I'm like, you are flying on a private plane, that kind of, you can just see people, I always call it like showing your hand. It's like, if you were genuine about this, you'd be interested in genuine solutions. Mm. Like Ireland has been is this right? I think this is right. Ireland's been hugely deforested, right? So wouldn't it be quite an easy solution, or at least a partial solution, to say, hey, let's reintroduce a lot more trees? Like, I think that's what Home Tree is doing here.
But I think you were touching on something, and Home Tree.
Go on.
Home Tree are phenomenal. I really love what they do. But you were touching on something there with the data centers versus the turf, Shane. And I think we have moved into this place where like there are you can point at like somebody, you know, churning up the ground and cutting the turf out of it and making a nasty turf fire in their home, and somehow that's like quite tangible and easy to vilify for some mad reason. But a data center
feels so clean.
Well, but like,
well, I don't feel so clean. Unfortunately, it's
no. I know it's not, but it's marketable as a shiny.
But it's also one layer down, because most people are not thinking about data centers, but they are quite happy that they have cloud storage on their phone. Yeah. They are quite happy that they can stream anything they want off Netflix, and they're like,
and they use ChatGPT. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because I was watching, and you know, back in the day, people like, oh, it's terrible, we're using all this plastic to make Blu-rays. But like, once you've made a Blu-ray, that movie requires very little. It requires no energy to maintain it, and requires very little energy to play it back. To stream something off Netflix requires an enormous data center running 24/7. And to talk to ChatGPT, I saw the YouTube algorithm just, I think, threw this at me just to annoy me, but it was a little short about Mark Zuckerberg on some podcast. Yeah. And he was talking about that new Chinese AI model, and he was like, no, we'll outstrip them, because at the moment America is raising more capacity to generate power than China is. And he was using that as a metric for the success of their AI model, that they can draw on more energy. I think people, I'm sure a lot of people listening realize, but maybe some people don't, cloud storage, data centers, AI, anything that involves streaming, YouTube, as I just said, is so resource heavy.
It's very resource heavy, yeah.
And it's constant. It requires a constant injection of energy. We don't want Facebook to go down for 5 minutes. We don't want to lose our WhatsApp for an hour. So it always has to have energy. So to tie it back around, Shane, you were talking about one very important aspect of how we can help the environment and prevent the current ecocide, again, to quote Dermot. But each individual on this planet is using so much energy right now compared to even 50 years ago. And like, what's the mindset behind that, and how can we change it?
Well, I think for me, it's about, you know, there's a current system that's in place, and you as an individual, you can feel very helpless in terms of the ability to change that system. You know, I do personally believe that you can work within your circle of influence to do what you can in that space, and you can work according to your own value system, which is what I do. And as long as I'm doing that, at least I feel happy that, okay, I'm doing what I feel is right, and that's all I can do. And I forget about the rest, and I let go of the rest, because ultimately the world's going to do what it's going to do. I think ultimately what we have to do is to have to build parallel systems. So we have to build parallel systems based on what we feel is the correct thing to do according to our values. And eventually the system that's there, I mean, it's so energy intensive, it will break down. I mean, I work in the energy space. I mean, like, we can't keep on consuming the energy that we're doing unless we come up with a dramatic new technology. And fusion's always been 20 years away. It's not going to happen anytime soon. So it's just, that's the reality. So our society is running out of time in that aspect, and things will have to shift and change. And I think that shift is already beginning to happen, has been happening for a long period of time. So there's people I've listened to before. There's a thing called energy return on investment, and when you look at when we originally started our industrial civilization a few hundred years ago, you would drill a well and oil would just spurt out, right? So now I can't remember the figures offhand, but it's something like this, right? Something like the amount of energy you put in, the amount of energy you got out was about 200 to 1, right? So you get a massive gain, right? As we've extracted more and more oil, that really easy accessible oil is pretty much gone now, right? So we now have to use more complicated methodologies to extract oil. That's fracking, or that's directional fracking, and it's to get it out. But that means that we're down to probably 10 to 15 to 1. So we put a lot more energy in to get energy out, right? But in order to keep the amount of energy, like we still use an awful lot of energy in civilization, we just have to keep on drilling more wells, drilling more holes. So we've lost the easy stuff. The stuff that's left has much lower energy return on investment, and we keep on pushing. And only when the price goes high, when the price of oil and gas goes high, does it make viable more and more of that drilling, right? When the price goes low, it means it's not viable to do that. So when price goes high, it makes the ability to extract more energy viable. Okay, but it applies to when energy goes high, then obviously people can't afford. Like energy is the foundation of our society. So when price of electricity and the price of energy goes up, everything gets more expensive. You see it in just where you're driving, but the cost of everything goes up. It's an inflationary pressure. It's a hidden inflationary pressure on everything. But so that means when the price of that base energy goes up, ultimately everything gets more expensive for everybody, and people stop spending. And eventually that kicks in, and then suddenly demand drops for oil, and then it falls off a cliff, and then resettles at a point where people can afford it. But eventually it will spike again. But I think so. What we're going to see, in my personal viewpoint, over the next 1 to 200 years, is that we will see subsequent subsequent crashes and spikes, as society readjusts to lower and lower levels of energy availability. And how we adjust to that descent will be quite interesting. We will probably adopt practices that will mean, I personally think that people will have to move more back into food production, because they ultimately, if you own a piece of land and you can grow your own vegetables, that's security, actually. If you're sitting in a city and you're relying on a job to provide your income, and suddenly there's a recession and you can't get a job and you have to try and feed your family, very quickly you'll realize, okay, well, if I had a piece of land, I wouldn't. It will force people to do that, to move back. And maybe that's a bit idealistic, my point. So I would prefer to be creating the system in place now, which is looking at, educating people about new methods, regenerative methods, ways of farming, ways of doing things, that when things do fall apart, that system can just snap into place for people. That education system and those alternative ways of doing things can snap into place, so that the society is in a better way to cope with a lower energy level.
And I do think people would actually want to make that switch as well. Like, that's the perverse thing about it, is that I honestly I don't know if this is true, but I'm just thinking about this, because there's such a weird thing where we use a lot of energy to make use of all these technologies and stuff. Like, say for instance, like Instagram or something, like people doom scrolling on Instagram. I'm pretty sure if there was a nice pub down the road where you could have a chat with your friends and be a bit of music, a lot of people would actually rather do that. But then you see there's no help put on keeping the pubs alive. For instance, and now pubs, you can talk about alcohol and all that. That's a different story. But, or say community centers or something. I think people actually value real connection. But it's like those things are being kind of either destroyed or at least not helped. But then you're being drawn more and more into your phone. A lot of services you can't make use of anymore in paper. You have to do it electronically,
Yeah.
And that's the thing, like the people who, I think a lot of the time, especially politicians who talk about the climate agenda and CO2 reductions, are also in favor of AI. Instead of going, hey, I think it's like, is it 20% of the power usage in Ireland is data centers?
It's substantial.
I think it's something like, I've heard that it's something like that, which is insane.
It is insane, but it's this old thing though, is that we're all complicit in that too. Like
we are, but I do want to say, like, my thing is, I suppose, that I do believe in humans, and I do believe that if people have a good option, they might go for that. Not everyone, but a lot of them will. But it's quite often it's like, no, this is what we have to deal with. This is what is available right now. I really think it's quite perverse in a way that it's kept in a way that people also won't make the positive change to keep us kind of captured in that way. That's the way it feels to me.
Well, I think a lot of people feel helpless, and a lot of people also feel under strain given their day to day. They, like most people, are in a situation of, like, whether they've got a family or they've got kids or they've got a situation where they're trying to buy a house or anything else. They're focused on the very here and now, and they're worried about their own level of security. And to be honest, thinking about the environment is if I'm in a nice place and I have got my basic needs covered, then I can think about that.
But that's what, yeah.
And a lot of people aren't in that situation. A lot of people, as you say, are in a mindset of scarcity. So the thing is that, like, that for me means that ideally what you need to do is you need to create systems that allow people to move into sectors where they can work in spaces that means they can make a living as well as doing what they think is right by their value system. And ultimately, if the world does change, maybe it won't. Maybe we are going into some technical utopia that we're all living in fucking, I don't know, spaceships and stuff. I don't think so either, and I would be quite scared, to be honest, if that was the result. I would prefer a world that we are more connected with nature, more connected with ourselves in the process as well. And I think that's ultimately probably the journey of the next. It feels for me like that's the journey that humanity has to go through, is that we have to not just come back. Nature is an avenue to it, but it's also an avenue back to ourselves.
Beautiful.
So,
is there a role? Can I ask one more question, Shane?
Go for it. Yeah.
Is there a role for technology in that journey?
In being open, I think there is. I don't think we can. I don't think you can turn around and just say flip the other way and close off that technology is all bad. I don't think that's the case, I think we're talking about AI and you're saying AI is bad, but maybe there's probably a place for all of it.
I'm not saying it's bad, but I find it suspicious that people don't talk about, like, the people who are wanting to implement really strict social boundaries on what we're allowed to do are also very much in favor of AI, but never looking at the fact that that's one of the most power hungry things ever. Like, I'm not against it. It's a new shiny thing, and people see an opportunity to make money from it, and that's why they're going to promote it heavily. Like, I think you got to be very careful about claiming that there's a certain cabal of people that are out to have an agenda to control the world. One, I don't think humans are smart enough. I just don't think we are smart enough. I think, though, that what happens is that there are ideologies that come into place where people believe certain ideologies, and that affects a group of people. And so there is a situation where we live in a world where there's a concept of the myth of progress, that we came from hunter-gatherer societies, we've been climbing up this chain ever since, and we're going off to some techno-utopia. That's been a belief system that's been around for at least the last 50, 60 years. But actually, when you look historically, what's happened is that it's been a very bumpy road. It's been a rise and fall of civilizations, and that's happened repeatedly. And actually, you could argue that. I would argue that we're in that right now. We're probably at peak oil civilization right now, and we might be in a downward trajectory until the next thing arises, whenever that does rise. So and I don't mean necessarily to say, like, sometimes we use kind of verbal shorthand for certain things. When I say those people who do this, I don't even. I'm not really envisioning like a shadowy cabal of people, because I do think it's more a cultural thing, and that culture will then have slotted into it people who can have no problem working in that culture. I think
policymakers.
The three of us probably wouldn't be suited to a lot of roles because we would just feel horrible, so we're not going to be in those positions. So I don't mean it, but it's kind of a shorthand way of saying it. I do think you're right, and it's more of a cultural thing. And I'm sure there's little cabals in certain places, but that's not necessarily the issue. But it does act that way. So sometimes it's shorthand to say it that way. Like, for me, it always come back to when I studied political science. They would always say, like, organizations will always do whatever they can to give themselves more power and extend their reach. And that's just because people have jobs there and they want to keep their jobs, for instance. That's one level of it, So I don't even think it's that nefarious at its core, but that is the way it acts, So that's just to explain that before I get delved into being even more of a conspiracy theorist than I actually am.
The Illuminati thing, I think it's just a comforting myth.
Yeah.
Like, it would be lovely if there was like 20 old white lads responsible for all the shit in the world, and if we just toppled them, everything would be great. It's like you said, there are systems, there are ideologies, and there are systems of affecting, like, a little bit of control over groups of people that are just effective, and I think people in positions of power tend to gravitate towards them. But I didn't want to, because when it comes to like the AI and all this energy hungry stuff, I love what you're saying, Shane, that it's not just about starving ourselves of technology or resources, it's about how we engage with them. And and
I think there's a middle way. Like, I mean, we have to chart it in our personal life. We have to chart it in our personal relationships, and I think we have to chart it with nature and with with our technology as well.
See, and I love that, because then we're back to it's in relationship.
Yeah.
Like you said about openness, it's in relationship.
But we're in relation to our phones, and it's fucking a horrible relationship for most of us right
It's
now.
quite an abusive relationship. So the phone is constantly like, you have to charge me, you have to give me energy, and you have to give me attention. It's quite a needy partner to have.
Right now.
But I love that, because in a way, yeah, it's like, yeah, systems might have to change, but we're not waiting for systems to change. We're also, look, and I think that's sometimes a mistake people make as well, is that they think that it's only protesting or something like that, which is very important, needs to happen, all that. But also, quite often, it's like, look into your own sphere. Look what needs to change in you. And I think one of the myths, maybe of materialism and stuff as well, is like, oh, you're one person, and what change can you make? No, you're a networked person. So actually, it changes a lot.
A lot.
If your behavior changes, you will see the ripples of that throughout so many people. Like, I kind of goosebumps when I think about that stuff, because I love that idea. It's like, if you set a positive example, and not from fucking some ivory tower going, well, look at me, but an actual positive example. And part of being positive is being open and being vulnerable and going, I know I was dealing with this shit too. This is what I tried. It seemed to help. That will influence people. And if those people have families or friends, that will change. I love that.
Yeah.
That's all in relationship.
And even if it doesn't, ultimately, even if it doesn't make that impact, if you feel better following that value system and you think you're doing the right thing, and ultimately if it doesn't change the rest of the world, at least you can die in a way that you felt, I've done what I could according to what I believed. And I think that's more powerful. And actually following that authenticity is actually what will have the ripple effect in the change. But you have to just believe in it for yourself, not for anyone else, you know.
No, I like that idea of it rippling out.
Yeah,
but you have to start it with like what we were talking about when you're dealing with your own trauma or whatever. You have to start doing it for you, and that's the only way it can work out.
Yeah, exactly.
Shane, thank you so much.
No
That was
worries.
a beautiful arc to an episode. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Shane. Lovely stuff.
Okay, yeah, great. Thanks a million, guys.
This has been Weshtern Philosophy. Follow us on all the socials at Weshtern Philosophy Pod. If you want to support the podcast, you can join our Patreon to help the show grow, or make a one-off donation via the Ko-fi link in the episode description. We'll be back next week with more chats and another topic. So long.